independence, if you recall, of what was then Rhodesia, from Britain. So I was caught up in quite a political time as a baby, not that I was aware of it, but spent most of my early years in what was then Rhodesia. My father was very much involved with theatre and with and as a writer, and he on television and so forth. And he was also involved politically to sort of working against the white regime, you know, who were causing such difficulties really for the country. And so when I was in I think I was 11, 12, we had to leave what was then Rhodesia and move to the Seychelles Islands, where my father had spent part of his childhood. So I always say we had to go to exile in the Seychelles, which of course was a rather blissful place to go and live. So I had some very fond memories of the Seychelles at that period of my life, and then was sent, because we ran out of education for me there. My parents had to send me somewhere to school, so I was sent off to England for the first time to prep school, a little prep school in Shropshire, and then from there went back to my family. Independence was happening in Rhodesia, becoming Zimbabwe in 1980, so we returned, and I sort of continued my schooling there. At a Jesuit school in Harare, where my mother also taught for many years. And it was there, sort of age 15, that I first was taught how to throw on the wheel. So by a wonderful Dutch potter called Frauke, whose husband was professor of geology, so that she had a wonderful palette of glazes. But she was the one who really established my love of throwing and of pottery and of clay, and was a very competent teacher. So, and just in brief, so from there, my father always wanted me to continue my education in England. So I came to do my A-levels at a public school, you know, a Benedictine school in Somerset. And that's where I was both introduced to Benedictine life and also continued with my academic life, so that I had a place achieved a place at Trinity College, Cambridge, read English. But around about the same time, I was also quite interested in the whole monastic experience and the monastic way of life. So my time at Cambridge was interesting, because I read both English and then art history. And then went back to Zimbabwe to work briefly teaching art history and working very much on a peripheral way in the film industry there, because my father was working in the films at that point. So I was a sort of, had a sinecure working on a film called The Power of One, which some of you may or may not have seen.
Oh, yes.
Teaching the children, teaching the child actors, really, or really just reading them stories. But whilst working on that film, I re-encountered Buckfast Abbey in Devon, which is famous both for its tonic wine, well, infamous for its tonic wine, famous for its beekeeping, and the development of a certain queen bee called the Buckfast bee, and also had a wonderful stained glass workshop. So I ended up trying my monastic vocation at Buckfast Abbey in about, I think it's 1990 I went there. So that was the beginning of my monastic journey, which lasted for 18 years. Shall I carry on giving a summary, Isabel, or do you want to interject?
Let's finish the summary, and then we'll go back and pick at it.
Yeah. So at Buckfast Abbey, I was, in my sort of mid to late 20s. I was a novice monk, learning all the things that monks have to do, sort of learning Latin, having to ring bells, clean loos, sort of sweep leaves. But I also was allowed to work in the stained glass department. And every day as I walked to the stained glass department, I passed by the pottery there and saw through the window this wonderful old lady on the potter's wheel, Mary Boyce Adams, who in fact just died just before Christmas at the age of, in her late 90s. And so I plucked up courage to go and talk to her, discovered she was completely deaf from birth, so she lip read. But she was welcoming to me, and she, I expressed an interest in coming to do pottery, and slightly reluctantly, she eventually said, well, you can come and be an apprentice if the abbot agrees, but on the proviso that I chose between pottery and stained glass, because she said you can't do both well, particularly as I had very little time really to do these craft things. So I ended up shifting my loyalty from the stained glass to what had always been my first love, which was pottery. And she gave me the most amazing apprenticeship, really. She was in her mid to late 70s, still strong as an ox, quite a tough teacher. She had been a pupil of Bernard Leach, the famous British refounder, as it were, of studio pottery in the mid-20th century, along with Shoji Hamada, the famous Japanese potter. He had set up the Leach pottery in Sentai. And effectively, as many of you may know, if you are into ceramics, Bernard Leach is with effectively reigniting an interest and the development of studio pottery, not just in the British Isles, but also further afield through his book, The Potter's Book, which some people call the Potter's Bible, which encourage a lot of people to re-engage with the idea of studio pottery and the whole aesthetic behind Bernard Leach's writings, which we might want to talk about a little later. So I was very, very fortunate to find myself being taught by a pupil of Bernard Leach and who immersed me in that history. She remembered Barbara Hepworth, the famous sculptor. She had met Dame Lucy Ree, who the marvelous Austrian emigre potter who settled in London, as well as people like Michael Cardew, another sort of luminary pupil of Bernard Leach. So through Mary, I really became my pottery started becoming a very serious thing. I then moved from Buckfast Abbey to Quor Abbey, a French abbey on the Isle of Wight, belonging to the Salem congregation, which might interest the French-speaking, the Quebecois among you, because there's a monastery, I think, of that same congregation in Canada. So I moved there for again another period of 8 years or whatever it was, and established the pottery there. And again, and that's when I sort of really took off in terms of making pieces a bit like this one that I've got here, which you can see on the screen, a sort of a calabash vase, I call it. So it's I'll lift it up slightly so you can see that's the base of it with the neck. So quite African in feel. I call them calabash vases because they reminded me of African calabashes, sort of gourds, sort of natural organic gourds to contain water. But it was sort of more subconscious than anything else that I ended up with this particular shape. And then you will notice that the thing that I started at Buckfast Abbey, here's my very first little piece that I did at Buckfast Abbey of sgraffito, which is scratch decoration. Scratch decoration through slip, which is liquid colored clay on the surface of the pot, which when it's leather hard, I can scratch through, and then it's glazed in various ways. So it's very much a graphic design sort of way of decorating a pot. And that gone to these sorts of pieces as well. So quite a progression in that development of that particular style of decorating, which persists to this day, as Isabel will vouch, having seen my pots in situ at the new studio in London. So in brief, so I had a very productive time at Quor Abbey, the monastery on the Isle of Wight. I met the sort of leading potter on the Isle of Wight, a wonderful Mallorca potter called Molly Atchell, who became a great friend and remains a huge friend of mine, through the encouragement of the abbot. And she suggested that we do a mentoring sort of project together. So we got funding from the Arts Council, and she really encouraged me to try and do much bigger pieces like this calabash that I've got here. So going from these very small pieces to a much larger, more sculpted form. So she really helped me take off, as it were, into the much bolder, bigger forms. So she's very important in my sort of development as a potter, I suppose. So in brief, I then left monastic life in 2008, and sort of joined my family, and have a sister in London. And really through pure sort of chance, my brother-in-law was walking past a little pottery in North London and popped in and said he has this brother-in-law who's out of a monastery, a home in a pottery, and there was space in that pottery. So I joined this beautiful small old-fashioned pottery called Dartmouth Park Pottery up in North London, and had a very productive, happy time there for 10 years, working with my wonderful elderly lady colleagues, Sharina and Tina, who were like mentors to me as well. And I started teaching pottery there. So, and that's really led on to where we are today, because eventually that pottery sadly came to an end, and one of my pupils, Lucy Atwood, the sort of co-founder of Studio Pottery London, where I'm now based, she sort of said to me at the time, "Don't worry, we're thinking of something." And basically, what she and her family thought of was to set up Studio Pottery London in effectively in Belgravia, although we sort of to place it somewhat more grandly than it is perhaps. But we have there 3,000 square feet of space, and her and our idea was to have a membership studio with members who join as in a gym, who are able to use the facilities and make there and use our kilns and so forth, with a small studio within that for me to work. Oh wow, there's somebody who said I've just walked past. Well, you'll see my pots in the window if you walk past there. We've got wonderful display windows. So a part of that studio is my own, which, as we are in full lockdown, I'm cut off from at the moment. But I think it's the case for many people that we have to persevere in this time. So and also we teach from that studio. So it's a much bigger enterprise now, Studio Pottery London, where I'm a mentor more than anything else to the members, and do some of the more one-to-one sort of classes, on to do the celebrity classes as well. So to my amusement, I taught two quite well-known actors, Josh O'Connor, who's currently playing Prince Charles in The Crown, and also Russell Tovey, who's a well-known English actor, a British actor, as well as other people. I mean, I don't have stars in my eyes, but it's always to be teaching a few of these people. So that probably sums up in brief my career. So I'll hand myself back, as it were, to you, Isabel, or to the forum for questions.
So, I mean, what's is quite striking when we listen to your summary is that it's women who have made you who you are.
Exactly. Which actually, in an interesting way, it was the lack of women in some ways. Although I was fortunate to have both Mary and Molly. I mean, that whole issue of monastic life, of separation, was quite hard to deal with, because I come from a family of sisters. I have 3 sisters, and I've always had very good friendships with women who've been very important in my life. I started teaching art history when I first went back to Zimbabwe in my early 20s, before the whole monastic interlude. I was introduced by my godmother to a wonderful woman, Pip Curling, who's a very fine artist, and in the manner of a sort of Lucian Freud. She paints big canvases of predominantly Black Zimbabwean women back in the day. I think she's now moved on to landscapes in her older age. But Pip got me to teach art history techniques. So yes, you're right, Isabel. I mean, it's the influence of and the importance very, very high in my life, which is.
And yet you went to an order. I mean, I know that orders are not co-ed, but I don't think they are co-ed orders. But
No, you're right. I mean, they were all male orders. I mean, it was quite rare to have Mary, for example, running the pottery within the monastic enclosure. So it was sort of, otherwise, our contact with anybody really was very limited. And also my friendship with Molly on the Isle of Wight, that was thanks to the abbot encouraging me to become friends with her. And again, she's sort of my mother's generation, I suppose. She's become a very, very close friend, and still remains a friend and mentor.
And I was reading, you gave obviously a lot of interviews. I've been reading a lot about that, but your ethos in your practice is very much about the repetition and the patience, and doing over and over and over again until you get it really perfect and you master that. And that, not that I know anything about monastic life, but it seems to me that it's this same spirit of contemplation and of repeating the same day to bring you to an elevated spiritual state, and that will and that work must. This got a connotation there. Do you find similarity? Is it for you a lifestyle that transferred from the monastic lifestyle to what you do now and enables you to have those moments of spirituality in your day?
Well, you put the nail on the head there, because in a sense, that whole contemplative rhythm of life, which was in the monastery, pottery in itself is very much about the same sorts of things. It's to do with centering, centering the clay on the wheel, and it links in with centering your personality in silence or in meditation. So the whole process of making, particularly on the wheel, although I'm sure for for hand building as well, it's a very it's a naturally contemplative activity, pottery, and so I'm very fortunate that I've had it as a continuity. Both was something that I really enjoyed, from my rather sort of began, from my youth, but it was very much encouraged and developed within the monastery, and it's what I took out of the monastery really, and enabled me to be a potter today. So, yes, there is a great sort of conjunction there between that sort of contemplative way of life in the monastery and the contemplative practice of making in clay, and also this idea of repetition. I mean, that also comes back to the leech sort of training, where you really learn how to do the same shape and the same weight on the wheel until you get it right. It's a sort of a reverence for the craft elements in making, which I also tend to, often am asked about the relationship between craft and art, and I'm very much I very much place myself within that more Eastern perspective, whereby there isn't or shouldn't be a distinction between art and craft. They are on a similar sort of level. Certainly in Japan, where the humblest of artifacts or things or something made by the hands can be or can contain an artistic merit or an artistic meaning. But fundamentally, all these things do require a lot of work and a lot of craft in the sense of skill and labor. I mean, I don't have much truck for the artists who bypass all the labor that needs to go into forming their work. I mean, it seems to me that you do need to be rooted in tradition, or at least grasp the tradition and become grounded in the tradition, whatever it may be, through drawing, painting, or making pots on the wheel. Then you can, once you've mastered that, then you can take wing and do things that are more innovative, and break away from it. Anyway, that's a little that's a slightly different issue, but I hope that.
I think it's important. Kathy Clark, you have a question, I think. Just put your microphone on and ask the question.
No? Sorry, yeah, it's on now. Sorry. Hello. Is it quite common in monasteries to have some form of an art practice, like beyond, like there's pottery? I think of in medieval times, wineries, depending on where they're located. Is this quite common to have some form of artistic practice that the community can learn from and participate in?
I would say so, because I mean, in the Benedictine tradition, which I belong to, the emphasis was very much on work as a form of prayer. So the whole life was geared towards praying. So it was, and everything can contribute towards that prayerfulness. So the work that you did could be prayerful, and it could be the most mundane work, or it could be artistic. And I think monasteries have always had that dimension of, sort of creating or illuminating manuscripts, or back in the Middle Ages, or cultivating art and craft. Be it beekeeping, which I was also a beekeeper for a while. So on all sorts of levels, yes, you're right. Those sort of activities are very much at the forefront in monasteries, right to this day. Of course, there is that slight conflict, of course, between sort of the art that if you are an artist or whatever it may be in the monastery, you have to be careful that doesn't become a dominant thing, that you want to define yourself as an artist, because your fundamental identification is as a monk. So you have to be able to withdraw from your art practice and go off and clean the loos, or cook for the brethren, or go into the church to sing the psalms, or whatever it may be. So it's a sort of balanced approach to activity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So when you left the monastery, did you feel that your art persona needed to take over your monastery life, your
well
life?
I mean, I didn't really, it wasn't really thought through in that it wasn't so overtly or conscious. I suppose to answer that, I was just very fortunate that I almost immediately found myself, in a small pottery in North London, where I could have a continuity of the work that I'd been used to. So, and working in that pottery in North London, and subsequently, I suppose I have developed more of my sort of artistic self, although that was beginning in the monastery as well. But as I said earlier with Kathy, there was always the danger of a certain conflict between myself as sort of artist, potter, and monk, and in many ways that it's easier now to pursue that more artistic identity, I suppose. But I mean, the great thing about pottery is it's always very grounded in a way. I mean, at the end of the day, you do have to sort of wedge the clay and do some hard labor, so you're always getting quite grounded away from being too sort of highfalutin. That makes.
So I have a quote here that says, because you are, as you mentioned, a mentor and a teacher, and you say here that you want to extract the best from our students and help them do better than they thought they could. What is your teaching approach?
Well, in the first instance, if people come to me who are total beginners, say, I really just try to communicate to them a sound technique for working on the wheel, and to help them overcome their sort of fears or their lack of confidence, through teaching or conveying to them my own technique. Which, I mean, I never exclude there being other techniques, but I found through practice that the technique that I teach is quite reliable. So I think it's important for people to be grounded in a sound technique, and then from there, then they can start, learning or sort of becoming familiar with the repertoire of things that can be made on the wheel or in other ways. And then on a more mentoring level with, say, the members who are much more advanced as potters, I think what I really seek above all is to encourage them to find their own voice, their own artistic voice. So you sort of want people eventually to find something unique to themselves and how they express it through clay, or through ceramics, so that they're not just, churning out nice pots that don't, I mean, not that I'm decrying churning nice pots, but in a way I find it more exciting to encourage people to find their own voice. But again, it's not a hierarchical thing or an exclusive thing. I'm very pleased when people who come to me who feel themselves to be completely ham-fisted find themselves able to make, a simple, fairly basic pot, but gain pleasure from that. I mean, I think the important thing is to encourage people to express themselves in a way that makes them happy in clay, if that makes sense.
So you were talking about allowing people to find their own voice. So we're going to see what your voice is. I'm going to share the screen and let's see, I'm going to go to the beginning. So that's the studio. Can you all see that?
Yep.
So that's the beautiful studio near Victoria Station. We can see these enormous windows, your pots on the right here, a class going on in the middle, more pots on the left. It was a very deliberate choice to be so visible and out in the street, wasn't it?
Well, I think what we were looking for a very central place in London, and we were hoping for a place that had as much natural light. So in a way, this was perfect because it's both on the ground floor, has these large windows, so there's a visibility to the people walking past. And we also, as you can see in that particular photograph, behind the pots of mine on the right-hand side of the screen is my working studio, and they are sort of like Japanese screens which give a partial visibility. So there's a sense of both people being able to look in, but also not being able to disturb what's going in as well. So it's a sort of both inviting interest as well as giving privacy to those who are working within. So there's a class in progress there. In fact, that's me teaching. That was in the very early days. But one of my former pupils, Vesna, who's an interior architect, she worked with me and Lucy and to design the space, and it was very inspired, I suppose, by my previous studio up in North London, but also expanded in a way that has little residences with Bauhaus or with Viennese craft traditions, as well as a Japanese aesthetic with the crittle that you can see, the glass sort of partitions, as it were, that divide the various spaces. So the idea, it's very much, there's a lot of visibility, but also enough space to separate. So not enough space to feel private as well.
But the fact there's always a dog on a Zoom call. You also right next to Victoria Station, which is wonderful because it allows people who live in the neighborhood. I mean, you're close to Chelsea and Belgravia, as you said, but also people who live outside of London and commute to come and take a class before hopping on the train, going home in the evening. Or
exactly. It's very, very central, and we're so fortunate because it's it enables people to travel from all over London very easily, and we've even had people coming in from further afield, from sort of south of England, who can commute in on the train. And also being so adjacent to Belgravia, we get a lot of footfall of people walking past who live round and about and who are, sort of frequenting the sort of high-end retail shops in Belgravia, which is also good for our the footfall and for sales, I suppose, of our work. In fact, I've mostly sold, sort of through people who just happen to pass by the studio and have looked in the window and have come in to, show interest sort of in the pots.
So we can see here the wheels where the students are working. So I took that photo off the internet. I don't think that it is from the studio, is it?
No, well, this was because of the lockdowns during the summer. A great friend of the studio, Michel Francois, who is somebody who you must all look up as well. We promote him through the studio. He's a master moon jar maker in the sort of Korean moon jar tradition. He invited me to go down and work in his studio in Cornwall. So that's me in the latter stages of decorating a big moon jar made more under Michel's guidance in a more Korean manner. Moon jars, I don't know, for those of you who don't know what a moon jar is, I mean, the moon jar is that classic rounded vase form, which is very specific to Korea, usually with a sort of a white glaze. But I love it's created through the joining together of two halves of sort of bowl-like halves. And the way that Michel showed me, I've been making moon jars for some time, but this particular way is a much more vigorous way that is made in Korea. Michel himself was in Korea for 3 months working with a master moon jar maker there, a Korean man. So he came back with certain techniques. So it's a sort of enabling one to make a more vigorous form. So there's one which has been coated with white slip, and I'm doing quite deep relief carving into the surface of that. The pots have yet to be completed. I only had 2 months there, but it gave me a creative space after all the lockdowns in London, and sort of enabled me to work in a studio sort of by the sea as well. There's this one here, Isabel, shows me holding again a moon jar form that I made for Collect 2000. When was it now? Yeah, it would be 2020, wasn't it? The beginning of 2020. So that is a form of mine, and that in fact I called marginalia, that pot that I'm holding, with a little reference to the marginal drawing in medieval manuscripts that monks, little doodlings in manuscripts that monks used to do. So it's got quite a flowing design carved through dark blue slip with inlaid white glaze, and a lot of movement in that. I'm very interested in sort of organic fractal forms.
So here we see you. We're going to come back to some of your parts, but I thought I would show. Those are photos that we actually took when we visited your studio with Matthew. So we can see you here on the wheel, forming again, I guess.
Yeah, but basically just centering, and here I am sort of opening out the base of a pot, using the speed of the wheel and the steadiness of my hands, on the lip of the basin. So I'm basically just demonstrating how to make a cylinder, I imagine. I think that's probably what I was doing. gosh, and with my mask on as well. Yes.
So can we talk a little bit, I think,
Yes.
yeah, can we talk a little bit? I'll just go show people and then
Let I talk about that one a little bit, because that was that particular piece here on the screen now. It's again a large moon jar form in pink slip, with a sort of a coral pink slip with a sgraffito pattern running through it. It's called Voyage to the Moon, and it was a primary piece that I made whilst I was artist in residence at Hauser and Wirth in Somerset in 2019, before the studio really opened out. Lucy and I had been down several months earlier to teach Manuela Wirth, who's as some of you may well know, is the sort of founder and owner of Hauser and Wirth. Her husband had, as a surprise, set up a little pottery studio for her, and she needed some help in getting going. So Lucy and I went down and I taught her for the day. And she, as a consequence of that teaching, she offered me 3 months as the first potter to be artist in residence at Hauser and Wirth, which was a great honor, sort of, especially given Hauser and Wirth's profile as a, sort of promoter of contemporary art. So this particular piece also coincided with the anniversary of the moon landings, which was happening in 2019. I was very inspired by that. So I called this Voyage to the Moon, although, I mean, it's got that sort of movement going, but it's a fairly abstract piece. And that was shown in the sort of entry area of Hauser and Wirth for a week or so.
How do you come up with the design? Do you plan it ahead, or do you just let the flow of the moment, the piece, guide you?
Well, no, the latter. I mean, I tend to just do it on the spot, and it's very much a question of just inspiration and how how I feel in the moment. I mean, I often have a sort of an idea of something of what I want to do, but I never draw it out. So it's very much a work in progress. So mistakes that happen, I have to incorporate into the pattern, because once you've scraped off some of the slip, you can't really replace it. So it's got quite a dynamic way of decorating a piece, and also trying to get the pattern move organically around the pot is exciting to me, and particularly in this one, to try and get that sense of momentum and movement, as if the spacecraft was sort of zooming off into towards the moon, I suppose, a sense of that.
And the white on it, is that a paint? Is that a dye? How do you achieve that?
The white is actually glaze. Glaze being, as many of you might know, is a potter's glazed with, fundamentally, with glass. It's the ingredients that make up glass when it's fired to a certain temperature. So all pots have this glazed exterior, if in the main. It's functional primarily, but also decorative. It's to seal the pot so it can be used. But this is actually sgraffito through slip, and then I've waxed the pink areas you can see on this particular pot after it's been bisque fired to 1,000 degrees. So then I go over the entire pattern with wax to resist the white glaze, which I then paint over the whole surface. So the white glaze in liquid form goes into the inlaid areas, or it becomes an inlay, I suppose. And then the whole thing is fired. And so the glaze is liquefies and settles into the pattern. So it's a very laborious process of making, and it's one I wouldn't really recommend to anybody starting out as a potter. Anyway, I enjoy it. So it's and there's the pot that I was holding earlier, the one I call Marginalia. Again, you can see very much those sort of fractal, organic, swirling, curling, fern-like.
Magnificent. It's absolutely magnificent, this, I have to say. It's just exquisite.
So it's one of my favorites, I have to say, as well. I enjoy that.
Is it at the studio, or is it have you sold it?
No, it's at the studio. I mean, there's some. I mean, the problem with my pieces are because of their scale and the amount of work that goes in there. They're more expensively priced than sort of other pieces, so they take a long time to move. So they're still decorating the window, I think, at the moment in the studio. I have quite a few pieces dating right back to Hauser and Wirth as well. Yeah. So
I wanted to ask you a question. I went to the new new art center. Yes.
Yes.
And there was there, which is an extraordinary place for those who haven't been. It's a house that we couldn't go into because of the lockdown, but it's on grounds that have these giant outdoor sculptures going from a corkscrew to horses on a chariot to absolutely extraordinary place. And they have galleries, they have residencies, studios for artists. And there was an exhibit there of Edmund de Waal.
Mm.
And I know that he is revered, and I know that everybody is hanging on every one of his words, but I have to say that I don't get it. I don't understand what is so. I mean, it's beautiful. I look at it and there's no doubt but it is so simple. It is so bare bone. It is. So what is it about him that makes people, is it his technique? Is it his activity in the field? What is it?
Well, I have a history with Edmund de Waal as well, as you may know. He and I were at Cambridge together back in the day. So I've known him for many, many years, and he's a very dear friend. But I do know that, I know that his work does, there are people who love his work and those who don't, it does slightly, can, and I imagine, the same could be true of mine as well. I think I would just simply explain why I think his work is so important, is that it's very much a minimalist aesthetic. But he really makes his pieces primarily in porcelain. I think it's almost entirely in porcelain now, on the wheel. And he makes these sometimes quite small pieces, which are then, the beauty in it is that he then assembles them in installations, in vitrines. And latterly, the vitrines are sometimes being suspended in space or slightly occluded by opaque glass or incorporating sheets of marble or gold. So to sense is that he creates a dialogue, I suppose, or an almost musical exploration of the way forms relate to space, so that the pots, when they are arranged, often he has pieces, little pots placed in vitrines on shelves. And the spaces between the pots, the sort of negative space as opposed to the positive space, is almost musical. So it's it's actually quite a refined aesthetic, I would say. I find it very beautiful. I mean, I'm fortunate that I went from Quor Abbey, my second monastery, part of my mentoring scheme with Molly, who I mentioned earlier. We went up and had lunch with Edmund, one of his earlier studios. And he presented Molly and I at the end of it with 2 pieces of his, which Molly is now the current sort of, she's the curator of them, but I think they'll come in my direction. But I mean, they have, when you feel his pots, they have a gorgeous tactile quality as well. You very much see where his thumbs have been and the movement of the hands. So they're very much something that it's lovely to hold, but in many ways, he's more famous now for his large scale art installations. But of course, he's also moved into, as in the recent exhibition, which has now been taken down at the British Museum and moved to Mosul, that extraordinary piece called the Library of Exiles, which was at the Venice Biennale. In the last Biennale that we were all able to, well, Lucy went to see it, in the Jewish ghetto, because of course Edmund has this incredible history with his family. Of the whole experience of Holocaust and diaspora, but it was a celebration utilizing both his pots and porcelain walls with fragments of lettering on it, naming all the lost libraries of the world, together with books and words. So he's quite a cerebral artist, and I mean, I think he primarily, he's more an artist than anything else, but he always reverts to talking about working on the wheel and being a potter, working with the hands. I mean, there's an exhibition which again is just closing at the moment at the Gargosian in London, of pots that he made in the first lockdown, which he specifically designed to be individual pieces, to be held and to be, and a lot of them have a little plasters of gold or lead to sort of talk about and some of them are broken and fixed with gold in that Japanese way of kintsugi. So he's sort of talking about the brokenness of the world and mending it with something beautiful. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, I could go on an item about Edmund. Is that helpful?
Well, it is helpful. No, it is helpful, and I will. I'll share with everybody his name, and for those who are not familiar. But I think what's helpful is that the only work I saw of him was at the new art center.
The new art center, yeah.
And it was all, you know, behind glass, and it looked like sheets of you know, of clay. And I thought, okay, I'm not getting this. I must be missing something. Yeah. Really, I am. So anyway, I think that it would be great if we open the conversation. There were some comments here. So Edie, you have lots of comments here. Why don't you just share them with us, or maybe you prefer staying? You don't show yourself. I don't know.
No, I was just commenting on Edmund de Waal because he's not only an incredible ceramic artist, he's also one of my favorite authors. So I wanted to share that with the group. And he's most well known for The Hare with Amber Eyes, which was a huge bestseller. But I actually really enjoyed The White Road, which anyone who's interested in ceramics and porcelain really, really has to read that book. It's fabulous.
Did you put it in? Did you put it in the comments?
I put it in the chat. Yes,
okay,
I put it
great.
in the chat.
I would add to that. I mean, The Hare with the Amber Eyes is an exquisite book and very worth reading now. I've been very moved latterly by International Holocaust Memorial Day, and of course, you know, his family history was very, very touched by that. As his grandmother came from a very well-known Jewish Austrian family, and I mean he's also linked with Marcel Proust as well, because the French branch of his family, the character of Swann in Swan in Love, you know, is partially based on his ancestor Charles.
He has an amazing story, and it's
very lovely story, and
it almost reads like fiction, but it's true. It's all true.
It's true. But also he writes very sparingly, a little bit like his work, his ceramic work. It's quite it's quite a delicate way of writing, a very understated way. He's very worth reading.
So well done. Gregory, will you do an introduction and we can have him as our guest?
It's about, well, I could sound him out. I mean, the thing is, he's now, I mean, he's rather stellar in the sense that he's sort of, you know, he's very much under the wing of Gagosian and things. And I mean, he was just, I could send you the link to, he was doing something on the BBC just the other day. I mean, eventually when I see him, I could ask him, you know, the lovely thing about Edmund is that he's always very, very, he's very warm and very, he's not a sort of an arrogant artist by any manner of means. But you know, I think let's play that for one in the future when I see him again. I mean, he came and gave a lovely opening for our studio when we opened at Studio Pottery London, and came up with an exquisite sort of, you know, sort of appreciation of what the space was like. I mean, he was the one who sort of, you know, referred to the Bauhaus and to the, I can never pronounce the word, but you know, the great Austrian sort of craft movement. Anyway, so some of you who are better at German than I will remember what that is. But you know, that he's sort of very much, he's got a sort of pan-European, pan-historic sort of sense of ceramics. There's a very good little guide to 20th century ceramics written by him, which draws upon and introduces, you know, ceramics around the world and in the States and everywhere. Because I mean, the problem with, you know, you know, as I'm sure it is in Canada and the States, I mean, it can be a little, sometimes these worlds can become a little parochial and you sort of forget the broader picture. And he's got a good sense of the broader picture.
Fantastic. Any more questions for Gregory? So obviously we're going to go to Studio Pottery London when we next go to London, and cross fingers. I don't know if it's going to be this year. Certainly in Canada, it looks like the vaccine is getting further and further away from us every day. But Edie, you want to see more of his work? I don't have.
Now.
Say again?
Is he in the studio? Are you in the studio now?
No.
No, no, I'm afraid I'm not. The studio's closed because of the lockdown. I'm sort of, I've fished out one of my pots that I've got at home, which is what you can see here. I mean, the thing to look at probably is our Studio Pottery London website, and there's a shop link there that shows, more of my pots there as well. But I mean, hopefully there'll be time in the future for me to share images of work. I mean, the pots that pot that you showed of mine that I was working on in Cornwall, they have yet to be glazed. So I mean, that would be the next project, is for me to go down to Cornwall and to glaze them in a pale green celadon, is what I'm imagining. So they're a bit of a homage to sort of ancient Chinese pots. Although in fact the patterns on them were inspired by Naum Gabo. There was a big exhibition of his at Tate St Ives while I was there. So sort of a mixture of old and new.
Well,
anyway.
mixed culture, it's the story of your life.
Can I ask a question? So how long does it take you to actually make a piece? Like from conceptual, like from when you're sitting down and is it all happening while you're starting the wheel? And is it sort of, I mean, you said that these pieces are unfinished, but I think that's because of lockdown. So normally, how long would it normally take you?
Well, I mean, it's a good question that. I mean, the actual making process, the throwing process, it doesn't take me very long. So often I have a sort of an idea that I want to make, if I want to make, say, a large moon jar form, or like this calabash that I've got here on the screen, I would make that form and then apply the slip, or then work out. And then, as I said a bit earlier, I don't tend to plan what's going to go on it necessarily. I tend to work up that decoration once I'm sitting down, and it does require a bit of peace. That's the one time where I really don't like being disturbed, because that's when I need my concentration. But again, because of my role at the studio, I mean, I'm quite often having to stop what I'm doing and be involved in the running of the studio or so forth. So it can be a little bit interruptive. It can take, if I'm allowed to sort of focus on it, it can take a couple of days or a week or so just to get the pattern finished. But I do tend to sort of work at these things, come back to it again and again, because I'm actually making it up as I go along. Repeat patterns are easier because you're repeating a pattern, like this one has got you can sort of see it's got a repeat pattern going on there. So once I'd established that, it was fairly straightforward. But the ones that we were looking at earlier, the more organic sort of flowing ones, they're much freer, and so they require probably more sort of artistic sort of, I don't know, sensibility, perhaps. Does that answer your questions? I can't give you a scale, I'm afraid.
No, I was just sort of like, do you start, step away, absorb, go, like, is it very flowy?
Well, particularly in the decorating, because I would stop, and then I would, I'd go back to it the next day. I can often spend, half an hour or something just looking at a particular, area to work out where I'm going next. Because I'm doing it as I go, it can be a little bit ad hoc. But I think I prefer that, because I think it's more, there's more energy in the pots, in the decoration on the pots. It's a bit like drawing, I suppose, or sort of drawing something there and then on the spot, rather than sort of having it pre-planned. So it has more of an energy, as I say, if I do it that way.
Henrietta, you put a comment in there, and I think it would be nice. You say that the decoration on the black and white moon pot reminds you of the fern, the bishop's crook. So that's a reference I don't know. So you want to elaborate?
There's just a wonderful fern that it looks like a bishop's crozier, and that reminded me on the black and white pot of that. I don't know if it was any influence.
Well, no, wasn't a specific influence, but again, I mean, those sort of ferns and those sort of natural forms, I often find my patterns somehow echo those. So there is something going on there with these. I think I think fractals are the word, isn't it? Or I just a former teacher of mine, a monastic teacher of mine, who's still around and active, commented on them as it's a Mendelbrot set, which is, again, in mathematics, where it's a mathematical formulae which work out these extraordinary patterns within patterns within patterns which echo each other, and you often find them in nature, like the unfurling ferns. So yes, I think that's a great. I mean, I'm always fascinated to see what people, look, see in my patterns, because nothing's particularly conscious when I'm doing it. It's more of a subconscious thing. So it always interests me when, like your comment is a very valid one.
I've got a photograph somewhere of taken in a garden in Cornwall near the sea, and I'll send it to Isabel. She can send it on to you.
Lovely, Henrietta. Thank you.
Any more questions or comments before we let Gregory? Yes, Beatrice.
I just wanted to know, we were talking about Edmund de Waal, and he often has done sort of installations. So when you do your pots, do you think of doing a sort of a group thing, or are they sort of one-offs in a way, what you do?
Well, it's a very good question, that. I mean, I've tended to do one-off pieces, but when I was doing my artist residency at Hauser and Wirth, I did want to do something of a grouping of pots. And I'm very fortunate that I have a friend, Anya, who's a research fellow at the Slade, she's really a painter, but she's been researching how to extract iron oxide pigments from abandoned mine sites in the UK, where it's sort of in former mine activity, and there's an awful lot of iron pigment in these lagoons and things, which she's been extracting iron oxides, which are the browns and the ochres and so forth that you see. And of course, iron is a very important element in decorating pots and in making pots. So she collaborated. She painted a wonderful backdrop of burnt ochre, this gorgeous sort of almost oxblood red backdrop for me in an area of the studio at Hauser and Wirth, where I was working. And against that, I placed some of my quite strong, sort of rather African pieces. And I suppose in the back of my mind, I would like to develop that idea of groupings of pots, not so much in the sort of Edmund de Waal way of being in vitrines, but just having them for a time grouped together, sort of in some sort of a dialogue. I think I was thinking at the time of a sort of reference to the great Zimbabwe, which is the extraordinary 14th or 13th century stone structures in Zimbabwe, which was the center of a gold kingdom. And I sort of wanted to have a tribute to that, with the pots somehow being like the spirits of the spirits of the people who had lived there or who'd gone before. So they had an almost anthropomorphic character to them. So I mean, these are ideas that have been going through my head. So I think I'd be very open to doing groupings, but one has to be a little careful not to end up jumping on the bandwagon of installation as well, because. But I think the thing with my pots is that at the end of the day, they very much still do function as individual pieces, because there's quite a lot going on in the decorating, in the surface of them. So, other than the idea of these, grouped, sort of statement installations, which I've yet to sort of do really, to any degree, they're mostly individual one-off pieces. Does that sort of answer your query?
Yes. No, I wanted to say, I went to the Victoria and Albert, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago, and I was looking for Edmund de Waal's installation because I had read his book and I loved it. And it took me a long time to find it because it was way at the top floor, at the top of a cupola or whatever. And then I saw Ai Weiwei's ceramics, where he had taken old pots and broken them and then rebuilt them and things. And I remember it was quite amazing, because I wasn't expecting either when I went on my little adventure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember I spoke to Edmund when he was making that installation or preparing the pots for that piece that is at the V&A, and it's something like 500 pieces, and they're all set in this great ring as you suspended high up with a sort of maroon backdrop. And his whole idea was that it's meant to be slightly hidden from view. You sort of can only partially make it out. So it is a very abstruse sort of aesthetic, really, that he's appealing to. But but I think it's what they've done at the V&A for your next hopeful visits to London. I mean, the V&A has got a most fabulous ceramic, sort of department now, and they've arranged everything very well there. It's much more creative in the way they've curated it, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we have a magnificent museum for that in Toronto, the Gardner Museum.
Oh, well, I'd love, yeah. Invite me over. Well,
Oh, we'll bring you over.
yeah, I'd love to see these places. Yeah, no, gosh, no. I mean, it's always a joy to see, see new museums and what and collections and.
Good. Well, thank you so very much. I think that we will let you get on with the rest of your day. It was an absolute honor, a pleasure. Thank you so much. We'll definitely come and see you. Maybe we'll even take a class with you if you will have us.
Cool.
And I will share your website and the studio's website with everybody, and also the link to Edmond de Waal and all the beautiful potters and mentors that you mentioned. So thank you so much. Thank you,
Great.
Gregory.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.